more renewables into the mix, we will do that, and that has happened over the years. Every year, government has looked at the possible prospects for renewables, and as mentioned just now, renewables are really rapidly going down in price, and I think we can capitalize on this opportunity to compensate for the coal that is already in there until 2021 or 22, and we put in more hydro, we put in more renewables, and maybe nuclear later on, but not before 2030. I think government now is making things ready for nuclear. We are building capacity, we are signing all the necessary documentation, building capacity and all that, but at the end of the day, the people would will be having the final say whether we want to go on nuclear or not. And as of now, nuclear will have a role after 2030 if should we decide to go on nuclear. So I think coal is there to stay, but should opportunity arise, like gas going down in price, renewables going down in price, we will definitely go for all these cleaner fuels.
Right. I mean, I think it's going to become a very hot topic as Paris, the sort of 5-year toning down of targets. Coal is going to become a very, very interesting topic, actually. Let's see what happens there. So we have a few minutes left, and what I wanted to do was give people a sort of 1 minute on governments, actually. So if there's sort of one message you would want to give the governments around the world, and particularly in Asia, what would they be? Mr. Oksana, come back to you.
Well, I would draw from what I said in the introduction that one of the issues is to focus on these non-electricity sectors of buildings and transport and industry, and how to deploy renewable energy in these areas. This should require also concerted and very determined government action to that to happen. It needs development, it needs research, innovation, but also possibly support mechanism, obligations and standards which can influence that. I would say that that is the more difficult part to influence than the electricity sector, because we are dealing with consumer industries like with electric vehicles, and we are dealing with apartment owners and building owners with building codes, etc. So it is more difficult, more diverse area, but certainly something where the government should act quickly, because if not acting now, we would not reach those targets. And that's one. I would also like to echo what Rachel Kite said, that the mental map of planners and government needs to be changed. So I think the clean and renewable options should be the base option, where you start from planning. And if you don't go ahead in your plans and in your decisions on investments for infrastructure with these options, then you resort to the other options, which are fossil fuels. So we need to change it upside down from the past and start working from the clean option onwards and avoid the stranded assets in the future.
Thank you very much. Toyota-san, do you?
Yes, two advices or recommendation to all the governments. One is to encourage all the governments to have an energy mix by 2030, or by 2040, and by 2050. Energy efficiency is important. The introduction of renewable energy is important. With big countries with big population, maybe nuclear is must, and also fossil fuel. And then you could calculate how much carbon dioxide can be reduced, and how much energy security can be ensured, and how much energy cost can be seen. And the second one is to let EGA to be agreed, Environmental Goods Agreement. Now in Geneva, the negotiation is going on, the elimination of tariff for environmental goods. I think all the governments get together and discuss and have agreement. It's very strange to have tariffs there against environmental goods. So I really would like to encourage all the government to get together and discuss and have agreement on environmental goods agreement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to say something again about nuclear. Nuclear is very scalable, and that means, I give one short example. In Sweden, we're 8 million people, no experience in nuclear. We're able to put in line 10 reactors in 10 years in a row with 8 million people. So that means small countries can do it, and it is scalable, it's proven to be scalable, and with that speed, we will be able to manage to decarbonize the electricity sector. We cannot do it with a lot lower speed, but we can do it with that. And for the governments, then, I think it's important to have harmonized regulatory processes and standards and codes, because you need to import a reactor from another country that is proven and chosen in another country. So to take on those regulations and to have a level playing field for nuclear, that is what is needed to go ahead. And be serious in your planning. You need to have support. That means not money, but policy support and regulatory support.
Right. Fantastic. There you go. And Mr. Hassan.
Yeah, I think government can put in policies and legislation to strengthen the enabling environment, to drive this clean energy agenda. I think without the right enabling environment in terms of policies and legislation, if necessary, things won't move. And the other thing that government can do is to facilitate the availability of financing mechanism. I think, as we all know, recently there was this bidding in Dubai on solar and came down to 3 cents per kilowatt hour levelized tariff being offered. And I was told that one of the reasons is because the financing is so sophisticated that it can bring down the whole cost of renewables to that extent. I think these are the areas that government can help to bring down the cost of clean energy and drive the agenda forward. Thank you.
Yeah. There seems to be a difference as well in the developing world. It's a lot about how to get the financing.
Yeah.
In the developed world, it's the costs have already crossed over kind of thing. Yeah. So it's more about rollout, etc. So, right. Okay, that's very interesting. Actually, we do have a question from the floor, and I believe you might put it up because it's about renewables. And Mr. O'Neill, it says, for governments do not favour one source of generation source over another, like Singapore, what policy support mechanisms can be recommended to scale the use of renewables further? So what are the things that make renewables more attractive, from a government perspective?
From a policy support point of view,
that's right.
From my perspective in the industry, the most important thing is clarity and predictability in the regulations on solar. Clearly, in emerging solar markets, subsidies like feed-in tariffs help to get it started, but after that, I very much encourage governments to use market-based instruments, auctions, etc., to encourage the use of solar on an economic standalone basis. And I'd also want to say, I want to mention a few other reasons why I've heard a lot of talk about governments paying attention to climate change and air quality. I want to mention a few other things. Speed. Solar can be deployed in a few months compared to a few years for almost any other form of power generation. So for speed and modularity, solar makes a lot of sense. For security, I haven't heard a lot talk about one of the threats facing the world today is the physical security of our energy infrastructure. And a distributed structure like solar energy with distributed generation is very naturally resistant to external threats of any sort. And I think it's something governments should think about. And then I also want to mention rural electrification, where solar can play such an important role. 1 in 5 people still don't have access to electricity today. Solar can be quickly deployed to change that. poverty alleviation. There's 8 million jobs in renewable energy now. It's going to triple over the next several years. It can be an economic boost to standards of living. And finally, I want to mention water. I haven't heard it talked about, but I think one of the biggest crises facing the world is availability of fresh water. MIT predicts there's going to be 1 billion more people in Asia who are facing severe water stress. Our current energy mix requires 25,000 liters per megawatt hour. A single 60-watt light bulb requires 60 liters of water to leave that light bulb on for 1 day. We have to think about energy sources that conserve and do not use fresh water, because that's going to be an important thing. So I'd encourage the government to think about all of those things when they're thinking about their future energy mix.
Right. Can I just ask, just come over, Ms. Racing, on the, for the developing world, for the off-grid, so I know you have an interest in the 1.2 billion off the grid. Do you want to sort of make a comment on that?
Yes, I'd like to make a comment. I mean, the development now, the technology development is that we have small modular reactors as well, and there is like 8 countries, 45 companies are working on small modular reactors and developing this. And this will be possible for very small grids to be a start of, as well as floating reactors. So these technology development will be for areas where you don't already have a grid, and when you can bring it in, and these are also having more inherently safe, and you can walk away safe, and you can just leave it there, and also for the proliferation.
And is the financing viable for some of these countries?
Yes, it is. They are, of course, more expensive per kilowatt hour than a large unit, but as you can add small units, it's easier step to take.
Okay,
so
great. Thank you. Yeah, good to bring that in. Mr. Schwartz, what would you say to governments?
So on the policy side, first of all, we have to elect politicians who don't believe that climate change is a Chinese plot to attack America, which at least one of our presidential candidates believes. Having said that, look, there are important policies on both the supply and the demand side. Probably the single best thing we could do, if it were feasible, is what Fatih Birol talked about, which would be a good carbon tax. But I think the political challenges of that are almost insuperable. What we find is California, for example, has a cap-and-trade system, which is moderately effective. And so if we could actually have a better cap-and-trade system in Europe and applied elsewhere, that would be an improvement. Better would be carbon tax, but I don't think we'll get there. The other side of the equation is impacting other supply sources, and particularly demand. So efficiency standards for buildings, for vehicles, for cities, city design. The reality is this, that today we are already past 400 parts per million CO2 and headed toward 500. Now, people complain about the weather here in Singapore, but if we hit 500, the whole world will be like Singapore. The last time we were here was 55 million years ago, when there were crocodiles at the North Pole. So let's be clear that the challenge is enormous, and therefore policy and private action is absolutely essential and has to move very, very fast on the reduction side.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I think we're going to call it a day there. So building the low-carbon future, as you've heard, there's a lot of moving parts. So it's easy to know what the trends are, but actually doing something about it is actually a complicated subject. We've only touched on a few things here, but I really just want to thank the panel for their views and expertise. Please join me in that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'd now like to invite our panelists on stage to have a group photograph taken as we prepare for the next panel, ladies and gentlemen. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the next discussion will be on disruptive technologies and energy and the energy consumer. Now, of course, this panel is presented to you by Sun Electric. We're just going to take a quick moment to prepare the stage for the next panel. Now, this very next panel, ladies and gentlemen, will be moderated by Mr. Tony Wood, Energy Program Director, Grattan Institute. I'm going to be introducing all of our panelists at this point in time, and we'll just take a moment before they make their way up on stage. We have Mr. Girish B. Pradhan, he is the chairperson, Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, India, and Vidas Nilsson, Director General, Swedish Energy Markets Inspectorate, Dr. Matthew Peloso, founder and CEO at Sun Electric, Aaron Domingo, Executive Vice President and a COO at Meralco Powergen Corporation, Professor Dr. Michael Wienhold, Chief Technology Officer, Energy Management Division, Siemens, and also Yoshihiko Kimata, representative in Southeast Asia, Osaka Gas. Now, this next session, ladies and gentlemen, will go on for a little bit longer as well, and thereafter, we still would like to invite you to pose your questions via the Pigeonhole Live platform. Now, after this, we will still have one final presentation going on, our plenary session rather, going on at 4:30. And not to forget thereafter, for us to have an evening together at the National Gallery. Shuttles will be arranged for you to bring you there as well, and we'd like to invite many of you to go to that session as well, to the evening networking session. All right, looks like it's time for our next panel. We'd like now to invite our panelists together with our moderator up on stage, please, for this next session. Let's welcome them with a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Should be ready. I think you're good. We're all up. Okay, right to start. Okay. Why don't we begin? And this session, having heard, I'm sure you had the previous session, more about the interaction of the various primary energy sources into the energy mix in the transition which we're contemplating. This session is going to concentrate more on how this is going to play out, particularly around the interaction between new technologies, changes in technologies, and markets and regulation. Because unless we see that working together, I guess we've seen evidence around the world where we see problems. My name is Tony Wood, and I'm the Energy Program Director at Grattan Institute, which is a public policy think tank based in Australia. I spent most of my life working in the energy industry. And in Australia, some of you may have even seen in the media, we had the somewhat unfortunate incident only a couple of weeks ago where we had a major statewide blackout, and many politicians immediately blamed the fact that in that particular part of Australia, 40% of the electricity was coming from wind power. And those who were very unhappy about wind farms immediately blamed wind power on the problem of having a statewide blackout. So you can see that there are many circumstances in which the proponents and opponents of various forms of energy technology and various forms of market regulation will find excuses and find reasons to either blame or support their particular version of the way in which this future should play out. And so this afternoon we were privileged to have on the panel 6 people who represent different perspectives on how these things will actually play out from a regulatory perspective, from those who are looking to more innovation in terms of technology, and those looking more at the way we integrate technology between consumers and producers of electricity, recognising that in many cases the consumers and the producers are actually becoming the same people, and you may even have heard the word prosumer being used in some parts of the energy sector. So the idea of this session will be, we'll hear a few introductory comments from each of the panel participants, and if you wish to submit questions via the website, you've already seen instructions on how to do that earlier, and we'll see how that discussion proceeds, and the objective is to finish pretty much at around 4:30. So with no further ado, we'll start from my right, your left, with Pradhan, and Girish Pradhan is from the Energy Regulator of India, but he has significant experience right through the whole energy system in India, and has some observations, I think, of the way in which in a rapidly developing large economy which is grappling with how to supply reliable and affordable electricity, but at the same time be part of the transition that we've all been talking about so far today. So please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to be back at the SIEW. This is an event that one looks forward to. The area that I'm going to deal with is disruptive technologies and how they put the energy consumer at the forefront. Now, a lot of things have been said. I've been here since the morning on which I hold views, but this is not the occasion, so let me just concentrate on the disruptive technologies part. In my opinion, there are 4 major areas, and mind you, my experience is mostly restricted to what happens in my country, which is India. So as far as India is concerned, the 4 large areas where disruptions have taken place, are taking place, and are definitely going to take place are, in the first instance, the very large induction of renewable energy, large-scale induction of renewable energy into the grid, and the problems that that's going to create for the grid and the integration of that particular element. That's one of the first areas in terms of disruption. The second is in terms of the distributed energy resources, rooftops, microgrids, mini-grids, etc., which would have an impact in terms of disruption. The third broad area is the digital or the smart infrastructure that's now coming up, and which is going to prove quite disruptive. And lastly, the area of energy efficiency and DSM, demand-side management. And this also is going to prove disruptive. As I was given an example this morning of the LED program in India, where the LED bulbs are now being distributed, and the target is to distribute something like over 200 million bulbs over the next few years. This is definitely going to be very disruptive. But before I end, I permit me to go out on a limb. I am going out on a limb, and many of you may really ridicule what I'm going to say. But let me say it nonetheless, because although the power of ridicule is very strong, most of the people who've been ridiculed have been proved right by history. So, which means that it's going to take a very long time. I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that the game changer as far as my country is concerned, and for a lot of other countries in the same situation, rooftop solar is going to be the game changer. I'll tell you why in two seconds, and then I'll move on. The first is, I want to make a comparison with mobile telephony. Remember when the mobile telephones came in, they were huge, bulky things, they were very, very costly. Each call was phenomenally expensive. The utilities at that time, as far as India is concerned, the utilities were government-owned public sector undertakings which had the wires business. And it used to take for years to get a connection, a telephone connection. Mind you, at that time, within a short period of time, the improvements in technology, the reduction in cost made a sea change of how communications take place in India today. In India today, nobody applies for a landline. They're all onto mobile phones. The cost of mobile phones has come down. It's all because of technology. It's all because people invested money in research. They focused their research. They got it down. You don't require wires. I believe rooftop solar is going to do the same thing in a very, very short while. Now, I've gone on a limb. Back to you. Thank you.
Well, you heard it first this afternoon. A regulator has gone out on a limb. That is obviously an innovation that we've seen this afternoon. So, thank you. Okay, now we have our second regulator. Anne Bedars Nilsson is from Sweden, and she's been, I think it's true to say, a career regulator. Is that right? If there is such a thing. But one of the challenges, I think, is the way in which the regulatory structures are having to respond to the political transition, the politically driven transition, at the same time as the regulators have a lot to teach the political leaders. So I'd be interested in your comments about how you're approaching this issue in your country.
Thank you. Thank you. Is it on? Yes. Thank you. My perspective will, of course, be very much from Sweden, but also in the Nordics, which forms a region, and also EU, of course. There is a big strive to harmonize the energy markets and the rules for energy markets in the EU. And of course, the energy sector is embarking on a huge period of change, and this affects all areas. We've heard several speakers, all speakers have spoken about this today. And the changes, they create challenges, but they also create opportunities. One obvious is that we are moving towards cleaner energy sources. We are moving towards more efficient use of energy. And in Europe, we are also moving, as I said, toward more integrated and harmonized market. And last but not least, in Europe, we are also on the path towards more competitive and efficient market. And I think this, the last thing, this is my sort of everyday job, to contribute to efficient and well-functioning markets. And it cannot be stressed enough that the consumer has to be in the heart of this process. Without consumers taking active part in the market, competition will not thrive. This is very easy. It's nothing special for the energy market. It goes without saying that this is the case in all markets. And if we want competition to thrive and consumers to take more active part, we have to make sure that price signals actually reach the consumers. Price regulation actually exists in many EU countries, not in Sweden and not in the Nordics where I come from, but in many other countries. And those have to be abolished if we believe in competition. But there is a problem, I think, for maybe a transitional period. In many countries, we have an incumbent company that is delivering electricity to household consumers. How do we go from sort of super regulated only one company to competition? This is very tricky, and it's something that is debated a lot within the EU right now. Of course, if the consumers, if the price signals reach the consumer, we also have to make sure that consumers are informed of different choices that they can do. And we are talking a lot about independent price comparison sites in the EU, and also how to reduce switching costs. And with cost, I'm not only talking about money, but also time, etc. But apart from taking active part in retail market competition, consumers can also play a significant role in the energy system transformation. We have heard the word demand-side response a lot here today, and I think that this is very important and something that we need to investigate into further. Consumers can actually help concerning frequency control, but also in moments of scarcity and capacity. And in Sweden, we see that we have a significant potential for demand-side response, but the market is still very underdeveloped. So we are right now being commissioned by the government to look into different incentives in this area. And this is also something that will probably be harmonized within the EU in a couple of years. Another area that has been very much in focus in Sweden, but also in the EU, is bringing market together through cross-border trade. And I think that together with demand-side response, cross-border trade is the key to cope with more renewables in the system. And I think here regulators have an important role to play, both that we should make use of the interconnectors that we have already in place, so looking into how the methods for congestion management, but also how bidding zones are configured. And I think that if we believe in those two areas, demand-side response and enhancing cross-border trade, I think we can avoid entering into more market-disturbing market design, like capacity remuneration mechanisms. And we can still reach a goal of, hold on to your share now, we have a goal for 100% renewables in Sweden by 2040. We'll see if we can reach it.
Okay, thank you. Now, we're very fortunate that Matthew Peloso is here this afternoon. His company is sponsoring this session this afternoon. But in particular, I think, from what I understand, it's true to say that the business model that Sun Electric is pursuing is actually challenging a lot of the fundamentals. And that's what the transition is going to be all about. It's going to be messy. It isn't going to be well planned necessarily. The regulator will see things happening which are beyond their control. The politicians will try and do things, and there'll be reactions from investors and innovators that they will be surprised by. And anyone who thinks that it's going to be nice and orderly and neat and tidy, I would suggest, is kidding themselves and kidding all of us. So when you see companies like Sun Electric doing what they're doing, I think they're to be wildly applauded, to be honest. But let's, Michael, if you could tell us a little bit more about how you're pursuing what you're doing, and in particular, the way what you're doing is challenging these paradigms around what we've seen in the past.
Yes, certainly, Tony, thank you. Well, quick comment though, Sun Electric does keep everything we do quite tidy and clean. Appreciate being here. Sun Electric has actually evolved as a firm, very ambitious early on to develop rooftop solar. I agree with our panelists that photovoltaic energy is going to immensely change the way that energy is generated in the very near future, in fact. It was our ambition to go and develop rooftop solar here in Singapore, and through our own failure in closing deals and finding commercially reliable fits, we continue to evolve our business model to a point where our business is matchmaking and looking at a way of taking electricity generated from rooftops and providing this to end consumers. But I think to comment on what we do as a business and look back at some of the statements we were getting previously, it's very important for us to work in a deregulated market. I think we're an energy retailer. So first of all, I see one of the interesting roles we play as a tech company to bring in new technology that we think can go to the market. We need to be able to access consumers. And in a deregulated market, it's so much easier for us to then look at taking consumers and finding capital flows that can come to support new technologies as we would like to continue to assist and develop. And I think that retailers play a very important and unique role in that they really represent the consumer. So when you think of innovation, we do need to see continual deregulation of our energy industries to allow us to go and create a much more diverse ecosystem on how we source electricity. But a couple of short comments about Sun Electric. We've also gone to see the new world of energy, develop as a software company to go and assist in blending clean electricity into the power grid network. But we kind of create an analogy between the energy world and the internet. The internet came in, it changed the way that communication was done. We had a previous world where communication sort of went in one direction, and it was sort of moderated. In the new energy industry, I think we're seeing the ability of cities to create electricity that can be passed on to other consumers. So infrastructure can be deployed to then go in the other direction and not necessarily just straight to the consumer. So we see a lot of these interesting corollaries in the way that the energy industry is going to evolve with companies like ourselves.
Thank you, Michael. I'm sure we'll come back to this interesting question as to, what's the role of retailers. I know in Australia it's a debate as to whether energy retailers represent the consumer or whether they represent energy retailers, which isn't necessarily, I suggest, the same thing. Okay, Now, moving from the consumer end to almost the other end of the spectrum is the power generation sector, and Aaron Domingo is from a power gen company that has significant assets in what have been the historical centralised large-scale generators. And we've all seen in some parts of the world as policies have introduced more and more supply from low emission sources, particularly solar and wind, without necessarily a market that can respond easily to this, real significant financial pressure on those existing companies, some of whom have restructured, some of them have gone broke, and that's part of the transition. So I guess it's interesting, Aaron, to think about what's the role of companies like yours in how this is going to play out.
Yes, we're still in the Philippines, we're developing primarily coal plants because the objective of the buyer is least cost. And given the current policy, because we are an energy market system, we are forced to work on the least marginal cost, and that gravitates towards a cost which is coal. And in developing those power plants, we see the threat of increased renewable, because renewable, particularly solar, is not a fuel. It's a technology that anybody can implement and put on the grid, and is becoming more and more affordable. And our investment, which we're going to make today, is a 30-year investment and a large investment. So we have to kind of, in the limited way, try to kind of anticipate how the market would evolve and try to put things that we can put now, given the technology that we have. So for our coal plants, we have to make sure that they are the most efficient marginal cost. So we look at supercritical, ultra-supercritical. The other aspect which we try to learn from Europe, primarily in Germany, is to add more controls to the power plant and equipment to improve the ramp rates and ramp downs of your power plant to be responsive to the load changes. And the other aspect is now the contractual arrangements and how we can lock in the margins given the variability. So we're trying to, in the ways that we can do now, today, kind of protect our investments going forward, knowing that we can't really predict beyond 5 years of how fast technology can change the dynamics for us. So those are the kind of things we're aware that it's coming. We're aware that we cannot quantify the level as to how much it will affect us. And so we're trying to, within what we know now and what we can do now, try to address those issues before they come.
Thank you. If you're we heard a little this morning earlier about the challenges that are being faced by the thermal fuel or fossil fuel industry, whether that be coal or oil or gas. So I guess it's interesting, on the one hand, to hear about from Aaron about the way in which companies that have invested in and continue to own and operate centralised power stations are responding to the challenge of this transition. Equally, when you think about companies like Osaka Gas and the whole gas industry, how it's responding to these challenges. And this afternoon we're fortunate to have Yoshihiko Kabata from Osaka Gas. And I guess I'm interested to think about how does a company like Osaka Gas, that on the one hand is challenged because it deals with a fossil fuel, which is, like all good fossils will be put out to pasture eventually, how does it respond to this research and development challenge to try and be part of the transition to a new energy system?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. As a gas distribution company, we've been working hard to implement the latest technologies for the past 111 years. So now we are faced with the new world, and still, our standpoint would be our capacity for research, development, demonstration, and engineering to the customer. So obviously, utility business is not just supplying gas or electricity or telecommunications, but ultimately to serve the customers for healthy, safe, comfortable life or successful business. So Osaka Gas was set up many years ago as a small gas distribution company in Osaka, Japan, with just 3,000 customers at that time, of which street lighting was accounted for 80% of the total demand at that time. And we've been running business since then with the motto of customer first. And now we supply natural gas and provide 7.2 million customers with the utility, which gives the cooling, air conditioning, cooking, sort of things. And electricity is one of the utility we can supply to the customers. And now scope of utility has changed, and it's extended to the district level, heating, cooling, steam delivering, for example, and further to energy management services. This could be the role of utility companies with other, of course, business partners. And this includes distributed generation plant, like cogeneration. And sometimes these systems are combined with the renewable energy system. In a way, it's store the energy. The intermittent energy can be leveled by the gas business. And in terms of technology, our primary target has been how to convert this invisible gas into utility. And developing gas utilization technology is our key standpoint. And our R&D center was established in 1928, named as Appliance Workshop, and to evaluate imported gas appliances and to localize them to be used by our customers. Today, the facility looks like those of consumer electronics manufacturers one or plant engineering companies. You do not believe that this is a distribution company's laboratories. Today, we are hiring 250 employees to work in R&D and D&E. The second D is demonstration, and the final E is engineering. So implementation is very important for us. So the object of the activities is to meet the customer's needs and realize their benefits. So we do not stop at the point of completion of technological innovation, but we go into further the commercialization and processes. And this is with manufacturers and engineering companies to enhance reliability of the appliance or the cost of the appliances. Introduction of various types of cogeneration system would be one of the good examples. And one of them is the really disruptive residential fuel cell type cogeneration, which produces just 0.7 kilowatt electricity for normal households. Could it be easier to let this work done by the manufacturers? Yes, of course. But it is utilities' role to develop a new market, to take the risk of it. And it's also good